when I'm out on my tours talking to audiences, many of whom are young men who are suffering the consequences of the sorts of things that we've been discussing. The thing that's been so terrible to me to see is so many of them are suffering so intensely for lack of a single encouraging word. It's absolutely awful.
Mothers just have such different styles of parenting, and the children that didn't have dads in their lives, even the girls did worse in 50 different areas, but the boys more intensely in those areas. Both boys and girls who didn't have a lot of dad involvement, by the age of 9.5, their telomeres were shorter, 14% shorter on average. That's the average between boys and girls, when a father was not involved in a significant way by the time that child was 9.5. However, the telomeres of the boys were yet again 40% shorter than the telomeres of the girls. And many people don't know that the length of telomeres when you're 9.5 years of age is one of the best predictors of your life expectancy. The telomeres carry, of course, the genes that tell you whether you're subject to cancer or vulnerable to any set of diseases.
They're determiners of senescence, right? Of the onset of senescence, essentially.
Yes.
Wow. And so it's that basic.
It's that basic. And
that early.
The impact on both girls and boys. I mean, there are certain differences between the lack of father on girls versus boys. For example, girls who don't have very much father involvement are far more likely to be pregnant as teenagers, because that's oftentimes by not having father involvement, they don't know how to interact in a very socially nuanced way with a boy. They do know, though, that when they're 13, 14 years of age, that boy wants sex. And so if there's another girl that might give him sex and she wants to keep the boy and not have him go to the other girl, she'll go ahead and be sexual. And if he doesn't want to wear a condom, okay.
Well, she has no experience under those conditions negotiating with any male. I know the data, it's a few years old now, indicated quite clearly that girls with fewer brothers were much more likely to be raped. And I presume, and I've seen brotherless girls among my clients, for example, some of whom were prone to sexual assault for all sorts of reasons. They had no idea how to negotiate no at an early stage. So by the time they were frightened enough to object, it was often so far along the unwanted amorous advance cycle that it was very difficult for things to stop. And of course, the guy on the other end presumes, often as unsophisticated as his victim, presumes that consent has already been obtained at that point. The girls with brothers have learned how to negotiate at that embodied level, the same embodied level that probably emerges or underlies sophistication that emerges out of rough and tumble play with fathers. And the paternal involvement seems really to me to boil down to something like a kind of a conditional encouragement. It's like, I really want the best for who you could be. And I'm also confident in your ability to attain that. And so I can hold you to high standards and enforce it because I think so much of you, so much of what you could be. Yes. And I think that is a lovely juxtaposition with that more maternal sense of, you always have a home here, we'll accept you in some real sense no matter what you do. Not that women don't put conditions on their children, because of course they do, but we're talking about the way that's expressed in a very practical sense.
I opened my email and I saw a letter from somebody who was a Hispanic young man in Texas, actually. And he said to me, thank you for the Boy Crisis book. And he said, I was raised by my mom without a dad. And then I was passed on to my aunts, who both neither had a father or a man for a boyfriend in their life. Then I was passed on to my grandmother. She didn't have a man in their life. None of them liked men very much. I heard negative things about my father, but I never really saw much or anything of him. And so I didn't have any structure. I didn't have any purpose. So I got involved with 4chan, and then I got involved with 8chan. And 8chan is a fascist group. And the fascist group gave me something I could count on, an ideology. It gave me structure. It gave me purpose.
Like a gang.
Yes, it's very much like a gang. Gangs give you respect when you don't feel you have respect. And so you become part of that family. And so he told me, so I wrote up a 52-page manifesto that was overlapping in its effectiveness. I thought it was even better than the two other people at 8chan who had become celebrated mass shooters. And he said, I was making the plans to carry it out. And in the process, I stumbled across the Boy Crisis book. And what he said to me was very powerful. He said, it wasn't the data that got to me. It was being seen, that you saw, it was like you were a spy in my life. telling me what I was feeling, the hurt that I had, the lack of structure, the lack of purpose, the loss of self, the feeling that I didn't have that boundary enforcement, therefore I didn't have that discipline. I didn't have anybody that would tell me that's too much, that's too little, that's, you're doing that wrong and you could do better. And you were explaining all that, and just being seen for my vulnerabilities made me not have the energy that I had to begin to continue carrying out what I had outlined in my manifesto. And so he ended it by saying, thank you for saving not just my life, but the lives of countless others, because I was really working this. So there would have been countless others. So I would have been seen as doing something that he felt was positive, that is helping the fascist ideology to be more broad spread. And so my heart is saying to people that I hear is that when we see a mass shooter, or we see somebody with this type of modality, we see that they're angry. And we tend to have anger at their anger, as opposed to having empathy at their vulnerability. And what this fellow was telling me was, you had empathy about my vulnerability. And when I saw that you saw my vulnerability, I lost my anger, or my anger diminished enough to not make me want to follow through so systematically on my 52-page manifesto. And I did end up going to a couple of psychologists. I did a few sessions with him as well. I wrote to you about it. You gave me some guidance as to what to do with him.
It's so striking, that young man who reached out to you was deterred by what was essentially an accurate diagnosis of his situation, and that was sufficient. When I'm out on my tours talking to audiences, many of whom are young men who are suffering the consequences of the sorts of things that we've been discussing, the thing that's been so terrible to me to see is so many of them are suffering so intensely for lack of a single encouraging word. What we're doing is awful. It's absolutely awful.